Hello, breadwinners. How are you this beautiful Friday? Beautiful sunny day in Austin, Texas. Um, so excited to be here with you again today for our Facebook Live for breadwinners. And today we're going to get a little bit geeky, a little nerdy with this, with some things. People have been asking about baker's percentage and sort of recipes and recipe development. And I just got super excited when that was the topic that was brought up because I like this kind of thing. Um, I don't know. I wasn't a great math student in uh, grade school, high school, all that, but I do like this stuff. And it's not that hard. It's all about ratios. So that's what our little chart, I feel like the weatherman here. I see the chart here. You see it over here, I think. So anyway, so I've made some drawings and some charts that we can go through, but what it's all about are ratios. And those ratios of the flour and water and then the other ingredients are super important to bread baking. You notice that I'm going to talk about all of this in grams. Number one, because we remember that weighing our ingredients is more accurate than volume measurements. Of course, if you don't have a scale, you can still, providing the volume measurements, but depending on how you measure the flour, it can vary quite a bit. So weighing is always best. So if you're continuing on with this baking thing by now, I hope you have ordered a scale to come in. They're not that expensive these days. You can get a good digital scale at a reasonable price, and it makes so much difference. So anyway, and then grams, the metric system is so nice because it's already based on hundreds. So ratios, percentages are super easy to illustrate like this. So a baker thinks of everything in relationship to the flour. So baker's percentage, flour equals 100%. And then everything else is expressed as a percentage, a ratio to that flour. So the most important one, of course, is the water, aka hydration. And you can see here I have this a pitcher of water, and a general range for breads is somewhere between, say, 55% and 80% water. So if you have 1,000 grams of flour, 55% would be 550 grams. 80% would be 800 grams. So that's your range there. Now, there are some high hydration doughs, and especially when you have whole grain flours, people are pushing it up closer to 100% water. That's all great. But I'm just giving you kind of that range of, and 55% certainly is a very, very stiff dough. Like a pretzel or a bagel might be down in that range. So in general, we're talking somewhere, usually with American flours, we're talking in the 65 to 70% range, and then varying it on either side of that to make different kinds of doughs. Salt. Most of the time, salt is anywhere from about 1.8 to 2.2%. And that can go a little bit on either side, but that's the general range. 2% is kind of that nice sweet zone with salt. And then yeast, you see I have a little packet of yeast there. These percentages are instant yeast. If you have a different kind of yeast, it's a little bit different. But anywhere from 1/3% to up to 2%. 2% is an awful lot of yeast, though. Um, um, I'm hearing myself in delay. Sorry, I have a little technical thing here where I'm hearing myself from a minute ago. Okay, there must be a little delay here, but then I started hearing myself. Weird. Um, anyway, so the instant yeast is anywhere from 1/3% or even less up to maybe 2%. But 2% is that's like you're booking it with the yeast in there. So usually, like if you, the traditional cake yeast, the fresh yeast, a general thing is for a French baguette would be about 1% yeast, and that's what that 0.3, so 1/3% is. because it's about a third of the weight of instant yeast to fresh yeast. So anyway, those are just some general ranges that you can think about your breads. So now, how do we figure out baker's percents? So you can see we've got flour is 100%. So if you have 1,000 grams of flour and you have 630 grams of water, that's 63%. 20 grams of salt, that's 2%. And yeast, 5 grams of yeast would be 0.5% of yeast, okay? Now, if I started with 800 grams of flour, then that same 63% would be 504 grams of water and 16 grams of salt and 4 grams of yeast. And how do I figure this out? Well, that's going to be our next little page here. Okay, so you take the 1,000 grams of flour, that's your 100%, and you want to divide the other things by that to get your percentages. So you have 630 grams of water divided by 1,000, that's 0.63 or 63%. Now you can see why using the metric system makes this kind of easier to understand, right? So 20 grams of salt divided by that 1,000 grams of flour equals 0.02 or 2%. And then yeast, you have 5 grams divided by the 1,000 grams of flour, your 100%, equals 0.5%, 0.005, which is 0.5%. Okay? Now, so that's all well and good. What does that do for you? Well, now, the next sheet here, we have our formula over here on the left, 163, 2.5%. We recognize that, right? From what we just figured out. So we total those up and it's 165.5% total. Now, say I know that I'm going to make 2 boules and I want them each to be 800 grams. That's that's the size of our sourdough boules here at Easy Tiger. So I want 2 of those, so I need 1,600 grams of dough to do that. And maybe the recipe that I got only made a 900 gram boule, but I want 2 800 gram boules. So I know I need 1,600 grams of dough. How do I figure out how much flour to use and what my formula is going to be? So I take that 1,600 total that I need, and I divide that by the percentage, the total percentage, so 1.655, and I get 967. So that tells me that 967 grams of flour with this recipe is going to give me 1,600 grams of dough. So I take that 967 times 1 times 100% is 967, of course. 967 times 0.63, that's my 63% water. That means I need to add 609 grams of water. And then 967 times 0.02 for that 2% yeast is 19 grams of salt. And 967 by 0.005, that 0.5% of yeast, means that I need 5 grams of yeast. And sure enough, and these numbers are rounded just a little bit because I had decimals, but you don't need decimals, just rounded. Guess what? It adds up, if you add all those numbers, to 1,600. There we go. We have our recipe. So baker's percents are very useful for changing the amount of dough you want to use because you're keeping those ratios the same, and you need to know, okay, how much dough do I need? Then to figure out the flour, you divide that total dough amount by the total percentage. Okay, I hope that makes sense. All right. Now, I have a little recipe here for country sourdough. And our country sourdough is going to use more than one kind of flour. We have some AP flour, we have some whole wheat, and we have some rye flour. So 100% is the total flour. It's all those added up. So if I have 770 grams of flour, white flour, 200 of whole wheat, and 30 of rye, the total flour is 1,000. We're back to that same 1,000 grams, right? Makes it easy. Okay, so that means we're using 77% white flour, 20% whole wheat, and 3% rye in this recipe. Now, the water, to get the percentage of that, you divide the total water by that total flour, by 1,000. Again, if we have 680 grams of water there, it's 68%. And the same with if we have 22 grams of salt, that's 2.2% salt in this recipe. Okay? So if you have different kinds of flour, the total of those is your 100%. And then you can say what percentage of each flour you have in that recipe as well. Okay? All right. All right, let's look at our little drawing here because this is going to show us another thing. This is similar to what we talked about a couple of weeks ago, or was it last? I can't remember. Well, when we were talking about different hydrations of starter and stuff. So this is a similar drawing. I have my total loaf of bread here, and I have part of it's water. The other part represents the flour, basically, and then of course there's a little bit of salt in there, and so. But this is a sourdough, so we don't have any commercial yeast added to this. Okay. And what I'm showing here is that from your total dough, that whole bread there, that total dough, our starter is a proportion of that. It's a ratio of that, and we can express that in the same way. Okay, so that's why I have that little circle drawn. That's our starter. It's some of the flour and some of the water, right? Okay, and so again, a ratio, sort of a range here. You can have anywhere from, and this is just what I've seen lately, and I've been comparing a few recipes from different bakers and different books and stuff. And so I've seen a range of 7 to 30% of the flour can come from can be in the starter. That's quite a range, isn't it? And that's how that factor coupled with the time and the temperature of how you make your dough is what creates your different flavors of sourdough. So there's a lot you can play with in a recipe. It's not just the ratios of the flour and water and salt. It's also, okay, how much of that flour comes from the starter versus is added in the final dough. Okay. And then, of course, we've talked about this before. I put that 60 to 120% water. That's in relationship to the flour in the starter. So we're expressing what the hydration of that starter is in that range, okay? Again, if you have 100 grams of flour, if it's a 60% hydration starter has 60 grams of flour. 100 parts, 60 parts. 100%, and that's the stiff starter, just like Easy Tiger starter. Ours is 60%. Can go all the way, that 1-to-1 ratio is 100% flour, 100% water, equal parts by weight. That's a very common liquid sour. And I've seen liquid sours go all the way up to 120% water. So if you have 100 grams of flour, you're giving it 120 grams of water. So I've seen that whole range there. And so that's what that percentage is, okay? Now, down below there, I have a chart that has my total dough. And that looks kind of familiar. It's a 70% hydration dough with 2% salt, right? But 20, and so I'm going to ferment or use 20% of that total flour from the starter. 20% of 1,000 total is 200, right? So, and I've got a 60% starter. So if the 200, that's 20% of the total flour. If the 200 is in the starter and it's 60% hydration, that means it's 120 grams of water. 200 times 0.6 is 120. So my total starter is going to be 320 grams. So in my final dough, I'm going to put 800 grams of flour in the bowl, add 20 grams of salt, 580 grams of water, and that 320 grams of starter. And so you can see that total dough adds up. It's the same amount. It's what, 1,720 grams, both sides. Okay? Now, again, what does this mean for you in practical terms? So baker's percents are a way of writing a formula so that you can make different size batches, like I said. So we have, if you know how much dough you need, you can figure out how much flour to start with. That's one way that a baker's percent is used. But it can also be used to compare two different recipes. So last slide here. This one's a little bit more jumbled and complicated, but it's really not. So I have two breads. I have bread number 1 and I have bread number 2. And they're both sourdough breads. And I don't know, they're both starting with 1,000 grams of flour. They have different water. The salt's a little bit different, and the starters are way different. I don't know. Are these going to be the same bread or different? So I'm going to analyze them by percentage and compare them. So on the left-hand side, that's my final dough. That's what the recipe from those books say to use. Okay? So bread number 1, it's 1,000 grams of flour, 720 grams of water, 29 grams of salt, and 500 grams of starter. Well, okay, so I've broken that down to 100% flour, 72% hydration, 2.9 salt. Whoa, that's a lot of salt, isn't it? And then 50% starter. Well, what's in that starter? First of all, I have to know what hydration my starter is. And I know from this book that book uses a 60% hydration starter, just like Easy Tiger. Is that from us? Maybe. So if I break that down, what does that 500 grams break down into? It's 313 grams of flour and 187 grams of water. That's the 60% ratio there, okay? So then if I add up 1,000 plus 313, I get 1,313, right? And 720 plus that 187, I get 907 water. And then I don't have any salt in the starter, so I just carry that 29 grams of salt over. Now my 100% in the total dough is now 1,313. So I'm going to divide everything else by that 1,313. So first of all, the 907 divided by 1,313 means it's not the final dough the total dough is really not 72%. It's actually a 69% hydration total. And why is it less than the final dough? Because the starter is only 60% hydration. And then you see that 29 grams of salt. You see in the final dough, in the recipe from the book, it looks like it's a lot of salt, right? I said that range was from 1.8 to 2.2. It's like, is this going to be really salty bread? But no, because if you're looking at that 29 grams compared to the total flour, including the flour from the starter, it's right in that range. It's 2.2% salt. So it's not an extra salty. It's on that French side of things, but it's not 2.9%, it's only 2.2 in the total recipe, okay? Now I have bread number 2. It's 500 grams of flour and 500 whole wheat. Well, guess what? That's still 1,000 grams, right? So my 100% is 1,000. Water is 850, so that's 85%. Salt is 25, so that's 2.5. And the starter is only 150. But I also know that this particular starter, first of all, it has that same, it has some white flour and some whole wheat flour in the starter itself. And then, and it's half and half. And it's equal amount water to the total flour. So that's 100% hydration starter, right? Okay, so then I add everything together. I take my flour plus the flour from the starter and I get 537 and a half, and it's the same with the whole wheat. And if you total those two together, you get 1,075 grams of total flour. So now if I look at the two flours from my starter, they add up to 75 grams. And so I take 75 divided by the total flour, and that's 0.07. That's only 7% of the total flour is from the starter. That tells me that these breads are probably going to be pretty different, right? Well, I can clue you into another part of this. This is just the building blocks of the recipe itself. But the other elements, of course, are the technique along with it and the timing. So I can tell you right now that this one with only 7% of the flour from the starter ferments for longer. It takes a longer time for this dough to ferment. So the top one ferments for about 3 to 4 hours, and the bottom one ferments for more like, I think it's about 8 hours. I can't remember exactly. And then I can total all these things up, and I'm looking over here. So in bread number 1, I added 29 grams of salt to the 1,000 grams of flour. And in bread number 2, I'm adding 25 grams of salt to 100 grams of flour. But in the end, my salt percentage in the bread number 2 is actually higher in the end, because there's so much more flour in the starter from the first one. So the bread number 2, even though it has less salt in the recipe from the book, is actually a higher percentage of salt, just by 1/10%, but it's a little bit, right? And when you're talking about a range of 1.8 to 2.2, this one's a little bit saltier than salty. Just a little bit. It's not like that 2.9. But anyway, so that's a way of comparing really what is going on in your two breads. And then, again, I've given you these ranges because those are the things you can play around with. This is a way that you can make your own dough, your own recipe. Play around with those things. So today you're making this bread and it has 20% of the flour from the starter, but you want to maybe slow down that fermentation and ferment it for a longer time, and maybe maybe it works with the timing of your day better that way, or maybe you just want to change the flavor. So that's what you play around with. Instead of 20% of the flour from the starter, figure out what 10% would be. And then use your baker's percent to, the hydration of your starter. So if you want only 10% of your flour from the starter, figure out what that is, and then times your hydration, that's how much starter you use. This is a tool for you to play around with those different things, okay? I'm sure we're gonna have plenty of questions. This is one of those things, it took me a while in the very, very beginning when I was trying to figure it out too. Now it's second nature to me. So but I'm hoping that some of these visuals explain it in a different way, so that you see that when we're talking about these percentages, we're just taking part of the dough, total dough, and figuring out which part of that is the starter. Because remember, this is all just about flour, water, salt, and then some kind of yeast, whether it's from the packet, commercial yeast, or the yeast from the starter, the sourdough yeast, the wild yeast. That's the 4 components to bread. That's what we're doing. And one thing we can also talk about I'll just touch on it now, but maybe we can even have a session on this about, adding other things into your bread then, whether it's soaked grains or olives or cheese or nuts. There's all kinds of fruits, um, those kind of things. That's a percentage thing too. So I don't have those ratios right in front of me, uh, but we can talk about those in another session because that would be fun too. But so think this through. It's all just about relationships, ratios. It's all about ratios and keeping those the same from one size batch to another, but also about playing with those ratios to develop new recipes, comparing two breads, one to the other. So, that's, when I'm thinking about, oh, I want to develop this new bread, this is the process that I go through. I'm like, okay, so what do I want this bread to be? I know that I want some whole grain in there for extra flavor and a little extra nutrition, but I still want it to be kind of a, not too dense a bread. So maybe I'm going to put 40% whole grain in there, so 60% white flour. And then, uh, let's say I want this to be, I want it fairly wet, and especially since I have that whole grain in there too. Okay, I know that I'm going to start trying about 75% water. And then I do know that I want to do this with the sourdough, and I want it to ferment in about 4 hours because that's how it fits in, and that's kind of the flavor profile I know I want it. So I'm going to do 25% of the flour is going to be from my starter, and I've got this 100% starter that I want to try in this new bread. So I'm going to do that, and so then I'm figuring it out, and so those are the steps that I go through. And then, okay, I don't want it to be too salty. I'm going to stick with that 2% to start with. So I'm figuring all these things out, and then I mix that up and ferment it and watch the dough and uh, bake it off and taste it. And then I say, well, it actually needs just a little bit more salt in there because it's not quite, it needs to bring out those flavors a little more. And actually, I want it to ferment a little slower, bring out a little more sour note. But I'm pretty happy with that whole wheat ratio and the whole grain ratio in there. I like that flavor, but the kind of still the structure from the white flour. And then I make those little adjustments and I do it again. So maybe I'm going to go to 2.1% salt next time. And it's a process. It takes a while. That's the one thing that's a little bit different about bread baking than like cooking, because you can't just kind of keep tasting along the way and adding and stuff. You got to kind of figure it out, put it all together, and go through that whole process, bake it, and then cool it down, and then taste it, and then go back and adjust and do the whole process over again. So, but it's a little bit different. It's not quite as like on the spot tasting and adjusting seasonings and stuff, but it just takes longer to make those adjustments. But you can still make those adjustments. That's the fun part. So anyway, yeah. Did I nerd out on you enough today? um, so yeah, I hope this is understandable. I will certainly be checking comments and answering questions, guiding you through this. And not this weekend, but the following weekend, I am getting super excited. I think this is going to be my favorite Father's Day ever. And I've been a father for 12 years now. I am going to be baking with my son Wyatt for you all, and you can bake along. I'm so excited. He's excited. He's like, oh, that would be the best thing ever. So he's super excited, and I'm super excited. We baked before together. We really enjoy it, and we want to show you how we can do it together, and we want you to bake along with us. So go to easytigerusa.com, order your baking at home kits for both you and your father, or you and your son or daughter, and let's bake along together. It's going to be super fun. All right. we'll see you again next week, and then we'll see you on the Saturday before Father's Day again, too. So, thank you very much. Enjoy your weekend.